Writers, are you writing about trauma and wondering how detailed to get or how to connect the dots when your story feels scattered? The solution might be a memoir and essays that allows you to write about powerful, discrete moments that are loosely connected by associations. If that's you, you are in for a treat. Because this week on the Writing and Resilience podcast, I'm joined by Melissa Fraterrigo, author of The Perils of Girlhood, named one of Literary Hub's 100 notable small press books of 2025. During our conversation, we explore the differences between memoir and essays, how to use memory as a portal to story, and how learning to trust your reader can help you decide what to share and what to leave out. Let's dive in. Welcome to Writing and Resilience, the podcast for writers who want to write and live the story that sets them free. I'm your host, Lisa Cooper Ellison, a writer, transformational and trauma-informed coach, story alchemist, and fellow traveler on the winding road of healing and creativity. Each week, I'll share tools, practices, and conversations that will help you let go of what no longer serves you as you create stories that change lives, especially your own. Together, we'll explore how to trust your creative voice, support your mental health and resilience, work with your nervous system and unique design, and stay connected to your deepest calling as a writer, even when life gets messy. It's time, my friends, to write and live the story that sets you free. I'm honored to walk that journey alongside you, one story and one episode at a time. Listeners, have you finished a first draft of your memoir but aren't sure what comes next? What if the secret to making your story resonate with readers isn't more pages, but instead a clearer question at the heart of your book? On February 25th, I'm teaching a live online class with Jane Friedman called Identify Your Memoir's Essential Question. In 90 minutes, you'll learn how the right essential question can shape your story, give your book purpose, and help you decide what truly belongs on the page and what doesn't. Whether you're stuck in the messy middle or polishing for submission, this class gives you a repeatable process to revise more confidently and start seeing your memoir through a fresh lens. Join me, Lisa Cooper Ellison, on February 25th at 1 o'clock p.m. Eastern Time to unlock your memoir's central question. Register today by going to janefriedman.com. Well, hello, Melissa. Welcome to the Writing Your Resilience podcast. I am so excited to talk today with you about your book, The Perils of Girlhood. I'm holding that up right now so people can see it because, OMG, I loved this book.
Yeah. Thank you so much. It's so great to be here with you, Lisa.
Well, it's my pleasure because, as I said before I hit the record button, what I really love about your writing is your attention to detail. You always immerse me in the experience itself, but you take me on this emotional journey that leaves me thinking about your story long after it's over. So you always give me something to chew on. And we're going to talk about how you did that as part of this podcast episode. But before we do, I want to give you the first chance to tell us about your book. So, what would you like us to know about The Perils of Girlhood?
Well, thank you again. The Perils of Girlhood is a memoir and essays about the personal and emotional toll of being female. It's my third book, but it's my first book of creative nonfiction. So I consider myself a fiction writer. That's what I've always written. But during the pandemic, I found that I was really just not drawn to stories or novels in the same way. It kind of coincided with the fact that my daughters were growing up. They were in late middle school, and I was beginning to notice, because of the pandemic, I had a little bit more time with them, time to see them in their daily life. And I began to hear comments, self-criticisms about
Mhm.
themselves that were both like troubling and also familiar, to the point that I was struck by how many things that they said or did reminded me of myself when I was their
Mm.
age. Like, I can remember going to campus one day and still mulling over the 5-7 minutes that I had with my daughter, where she was crying about the way her legs looked in her pants. I didn't really know what am I supposed to do? I remembered when I was a kid and would complain about something to my mom. First of all, she may not say anything, and then or she might say, "Quit complaining." When you share that stuff with other people, it's hard to figure out what kind of response to offer. And so I really fixated on maybe the best thing that I could do would be to go back and look at my own life and my experiences with girlhood. How did those beliefs come to be? And then how might I use that sort of understanding to help them going forward?
Yeah, and as you were talking about that, I'm vividly imagining a scene that you created in your book about the lengths that the narrator went through to shape her legs, those
Yeah,
nightly exercises.
yeah.
And it was such a powerful moment that said so much about not just the pressures that girls experience based on all of the images, all of the messages that we get both explicitly and implicitly about what we're supposed to look like, who we are, or who
Mhm.
we're supposed to be for everyone else. And so that pressure from the outside world, but also the pressures that we put on ourselves in response to that.
Yeah, and it's 2026 and you would think that some things have changed. But part of it is being human, but the other part of it really is truly just being female and
Yes.
the complexity of both, wanting to excel and wanting to be valued maybe for your mind, or
Mhm.
in your ideas, but then also, looking on your screen or watching something on Netflix and realizing that it ultimately just comes down to the shape of your bottom or whatever it might
Mhm.
be. And I think I kind of explored that complexity a little bit in the first essay in Coach Matt. That has to do with, in that first essay, which was actually the second essay that I wrote in the book, it has to do with when I was 14 years old. I had a huge crush on my swim coach, and he ultimately kind of took advantage of me. And I think that that was an experience that I held on to and I took with me for a great deal
Mhm.
of my life. I thought that I had done something wrong, that I, in some way, maybe had invited his inappropriate touch. And it wasn't until I think I wrote that essay that I was able to more thoroughly get to the bottom of that experience and realize
Mhm.
I had done nothing wrong. And yet also touch on the fact that adolescence is a really confusing time for a
Yeah.
girl,
Oh my gosh. There is not an amount of money that you could pay me in order to get me to go back to that time.
right?
And I would also say, thank goodness I at least did this as a Gen Xer when there was no social media around. So, yes, there were all of these messages and images and things we had to contend to, but I feel like it's on steroids right now because it's inescapable and it's other women who are supposed to be quote unquote real. We'll talk about influencers and they're doing all of these things and it's like, "Oh, well, this person who is so much like me, it's not an airbrushed model on say Cosmo is doing so and so or they look like this. Why don't I?"
Right. Yeah, and I think we're all so much in the thick of it. I mean, if you think about
Yeah.
it, we've been living this way really for, I don't know, maybe 20 years. It hasn't been that long.
Right.
We did not grow, we were not of the internet generation. We didn't grow up with it. And so it's going to be fascinating in a couple decades to explore the way that this is changing our brains, I think ultimately.
Yes. And we could have a whole conversation about just social media and the impact on the brain because it's huge. And I think, yeah, in 5 to 10 years, we're going to have a better sense of what that is and how that's happened. But if we take this back to your book and how we distill these messages and understand the lessons that come from our experiences, before we hit the record button, we were talking about the difference between how you might approach an essay versus how you approach a memoir and essay. So I'm going to give you a two-part question. The first is, what is your definition of a memoir and essays, and how is it different from, say, a traditional memoir or an essay collection? And then we're going to talk about the differences between how you approached this book and how you might approach maybe a more traditional essay. We'll shelve that, but let's first talk about memoir and essays, and essay collection.
Yeah, I think I see a memoir and essay form as something that's less linear. It
Mhm.
encourages leaps. It is a little bit more associative, and I think it reflects memory and the way our minds work. Throughout, for instance, The Perils of Girlhood, there are moments that I return to throughout the book as kind of like almost like an image patterning or a map, as a way to kind of, I guess, serve as a touchstone to the reader
Mhm.
to give us a sense of a whole life. Because with a memoir and essays, in my mind, when you read the book in the way that it appears on the page, it should still give you a sense of a whole life, even though there are going to be some leaps in time between chapters, between moments where we see individual characters. But I think one thing that the memoir and essay form has to do is the chapters themselves, the beginnings and endings of the chapters. I think you're looking a little bit more closely at how they touch one another. It's almost like Legos and how they fit. Whereas with a strict memoir, I see that as something that's a little bit more chronological. I mean, there might be
Mhm.
braiding in there, but to me, a memoir itself is something that has maybe a little bit more of a clear vision, not just of
Mhm.
where it's headed, but where it's gonna end.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, there's what I'm going to say, to quote Dinty Moore, the magnetic river of the
Yes.
story is much clearer. So if we were to think about this metaphorically, I would say traditional memoir is more like an actual river. We're always in the same water. Whereas I would say that memoir and essay is a little bit more like hopping from rock to rock in a creek, right? There's water flowing around it. So there's this sense that we are moving in one direction,
Yeah.
but we are on the rocks versus
Yes.
floating in the water.
And isn't that the fun of it? Because
Yeah.
when you're going from one rock to the other, you could slip and fall.
Yes.
And
Yes.
that's the real joy of it, because you as the author are working to make sense of, your life, your words. You're doing that exploring on the page versus, again, with that river, you kind of, you're kind of always sailing in the same water, as you said, the same direction.
Yeah. And the level of linking between chapters is different. And one thing that I noticed when I looked at the back of your book is that some of these essays were written quite a while ago.
Mhm.
And so you put them together. So how long did it take you to write this book, and when did you actually know, oh, this is an actual book. This is a collection and a project for me?
Yeah, the book itself probably took about 5 years, and that's during a time where I knew, or that's when I was working on it. But ultimately, I mean, it kind of took a lifetime because, as you said, some of the pieces were much older. And I think, again, that's kind of the glory of writing, in that you write something, you might have written it 10 years ago, but it still lives with you because
Yes.
you, in the process of writing it, create it, make it into being. And so it's still kind of sorting around in you, jostling around, whether in your brain or your heart or wherever you think your work resides. And so that memoir and essay form, I believe, gives you a chance to kind of draw connections between
Mhm.
these disparate moments of your life.
Yeah, and I love how you added those touchstones. So what I'm going to say is that if this were, say, a more traditional memoir, and you included some of the same content, at different points, I would say, oh, that's repetition,
Hmm.
right? Oh, you're telling me this again. Why are you telling me this again? I already know it. But I think the way you do this, that associative nature, when you add those same details in a slightly different form in a later essay, I go, oh, yeah, this is how this links to this. This is the association that I can make between these different essays and see it as a whole project.
Yeah, I think that's something that I learned from fiction, from stories and novels, and that is how you have to trust your reader. You have to invite them along on a journey with you. And
Mhm.
you can do that through really imagery and concrete detail is where it's
Mhm.
at. Because, you can say fruit or you can say apple. If you're specific, your reader's going to have an image in their mind. They're going to have
Yeah.
something specific in their mind, and that's going to allow them to begin to invest themselves in the piece because they're right there with you. And that was something that I really tried hard to do in the Perils of Girlhood. I can't tell you how much I'm bothered by books that don't consider my intelligence in the way that I'm able to put pieces
Mhm.
together when I read.
Yeah, I think that is something that I really want all listeners who are writing a memoir to hear is that a lot of this is trusting the reader and allowing them to fill in the blanks, which means you don't have to spell every single thing out. Do you have to make enough links that they can make sense of it? Absolutely. But you want your reader to chew on the information after and to leave with questions rather than certainty, because that's how they bring some of themselves to the work.
Absolutely. I love that. I love that idea of chewing on something because the first time that you're exposed, for instance, in the Perils of Girlhood, the first essay that I wrote was More Like Dad, which is actually the fifth one in the book.
Hmm.
And it has to do with my dad's pretty turbulent anger as a child and how I kind of tried to placate that. And then ultimately in later life, discovered that sometimes I had quite a temper with my daughters as well. And there's a scene in that essay where my dad bought a boat and we took the boat out for a day, and then it was time to take the boat out of the water, and it was really crowded, and my dad was just so upset with us because we didn't know the proper way to get the boat out of the water, and he was anxious to begin with. And so rather than just stating like my dad was angry, I kind of took the time to create the scene, and I talk about the fact that our feet, because we were kind of scampering to catch up with him after we had taken the boat out of the water, were chalked white because of the gravel parking lot. And so that has kind of a negative connotation. So that kind of hints
Hmm.
at mood. And then later we're driving home and he doesn't start to speak to us until we're kind of ascending this hill. And this is where he mentions the fact that, no matter what, if he dies the next day, we've got to know how to get the boat out of the water. And
Mm.
I was suddenly like, oh my God, dad is dying. But I also took a moment there to detail what I saw outside of the window, to see
Hmm.
the folks that we were driving by, that they had, rusted scooters and tricycles, and just taking a moment like that to allow the reader not just to see that moment, but to pick up on the mood.
Hmm.
I could have just focused on what my dad said and let that be it, but there are other ways, again, to invite the reader into a moment.
Yeah, and one of the things we were also talking about before I hit the record button was how you approach the essay or how you enter the essay, and the difference between these memoirs and essay versus, like, say, a more traditional essay. The idea of entering with a memory versus entering with an idea. Can you say more about that?
Yeah, I've always heard that an essayist is somebody who is, exploring and speculating and really wrestling with an idea. So they're
Hmm.
starting with an idea. They know what that question is that they are in pursuit of. I start with a memory. but and the memory serves as a portal or an
Mm-hmm.
opening into the essay itself. But that doesn't mean that I'm not still exploring or speculating. It just offers me a different, maybe, avenue to begin.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the memory is a portal to story, right? It's the portal to understanding the ideas behind our experiences or the ideas that inform our experiences. And I'm curious to know, as you were doing this and you were entering some memories that were challenging, right? So this book isn't dark, 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 dark. There's lots of light in the book and really beautiful moments of deep love with your daughters, with friends, with things that you're exploring. But there are challenging moments of experience in dealing with the male gaze and an aggressive male gaze that you don't know what's going to happen, sexual assault, the images that we have to contend with, or the ways that the outside world impacts our body image, or and eating disorders. You bring us into this world in a way that is really visceral, and yet it's not too much. And I think that's a fine line that can be challenging for authors to walk, right? To know, how much do I need to offer so that A, it makes sense, and B, I feel like I'm there. And yet, when do I hold back so that I'm not traumatizing the reader? How did you make those decisions when you were writing this book?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of that comes back to trusting the reader and
Mm-hmm.
and offering, action and dialogue and description, showing us things and
Yeah.
letting the image speak for itself. Because when the reader encounters an image, just like that scene I was talking about with my dad, the reader can decide to begin to, oh, I remember, this, I remember what my dad's temper was like. They can decide what
Mm-hmm.
they want to take from it.
Yeah.
Because I think there's something different when you're telling someone, well, this is how it is. There's a period at the end of the sentence, and that's just it. I don't want to entertain anything else. I think it's important to consider the fact that you don't know everything. And I tried
Mm-hmm.
to signal that to the readers throughout the book. In fact, I've heard from some readers that they found that frustrating. I think
Mm.
people, one of my very first readings for the book, somebody stood up at the, we were doing like a Q&A, and they were talking about how angry they are that women still have to deal with the male gaze,
Yeah.
and it shouldn't, this shouldn't still be the issue. It was the same thing when she was in high school, and she was just very, very angry. And I didn't know what to say to her on two counts. First of all, because it was a reading, and then secondly, who am I to say, this is how something should be. I tried to write the
Mm-hmm.
book in a way that readers could reflect on their own experiences, or, as you said, go back and chew on something, versus me stating, okay, this is what the next step is. This is not an analysis or a heavy-handed critique that says this is what the next step should be.
Yeah, and what I hear from you now and what I experienced in your book is that you want to write as non-judgmentally as you can. Like, just share what the situation is without editorializing it by going like, breaker one, I want to point out here through this detail that my dad's a jerk right now.
That's funny. Yeah, and you bring up a really good point, and that is, how do you do that? How
Mhm.
can you write in a non-judgmental fashion? And maybe again, it simply returns to trusting that the reader will take from that moment what they need.
Yes. And yeah, and I think that lets us off the hook as writers. Like, we don't have to provide all of it. We can allow the reader to provide some of it themselves. And so I want to dive a little deeper into your book by talking specifically about the essays in it. And I asked you to get an excerpt ready. And so I'm wondering if we can start there so people can hear your beautiful words.
Well, thank you. I'm just going to read from the first like page and a half of The Perils of Girlhood. So this is an essay that's about 3/4 of the way through the book and serves as the title essay. The Perils of Girlhood. The bodies of Liberty German and Abigail Williams were found in a wooded area about 50 feet north of Deer Creek in Delphi, Indiana. They weren't far from the old Monon Trail, where Liberty's older sister dropped off the middle schoolers to go hiking on an unseasonably warm day on February 13th, 2017. Liberty excelled in math and science. In all the newspaper photos, the eighth grader's broad face grinned wide with confidence. Her corn silk colored hair hung in loose waves, maybe unbrushed or maybe just indifferent. Liberty was also the one who carried a cell phone with her that day. She loved softball, and that year Abigail had promised to join Liberty's team. At 13, Abigail was a year younger. In the photo printed in the newspaper, she wore a sundress with an oversized sun hat. A 2-inch band of fabric at the crown matched her dress. Her front teeth were nubs not yet fully grown. Everything I learned about them came from newspaper articles I read and reread. That was 4 years ago when my twin daughters were 8 and years away from being teenagers. Now they are 12, just 1 year younger than Abigail, and I have become a crucible of fear. When a TV show featured a special on Liberty and Abigail in April 2020, I didn't let the girls watch it, but I did. Riveted by the screen, I tried to make sense of the murders. We live 20 miles from Delphi in West Lafayette, Indiana. We moved here in 2010 after living in Philadelphia while my husband finished school and I worked as a freelance writer. In between time at my desk, I took care of our girls. In the mornings, I pushed them in a double stroller to Fairmount Park, which we nicknamed Tree Park because it was hidden beneath a towering mass of craggy oaks. During afternoon strolls, we bumped along cobblestone streets southeast of our apartment past $1 million flats to Schuylkill Park. There were only 2 baby swings, so I placed the girls in one swing back to back, like some chubby 2-sided mammal. Then in December, at 13 months old, Eva had her first seizure. Despite subsequent testing, the doctors never could provide a reason for Eva's initial life-threatening seizure, one that left her intubated, a respirator tunneling up and down, breathing for her. All this alerted me to my daughter's mortality. One of the reasons we moved to Indiana was because we thought it would be a safe place to raise our girls. For a while it was. They were 8 when Liberty and Abigail were murdered.
I just love this essay, I have to say. So, what do you want us to know about this essay? And I'm curious to know why it shows up so far into the book when it happens to be the title of the book.
Yeah. So The Perils of Girlhood, that essay is a braided essay. So I bring in 3 different threads. We've got the murder of these 2 eighth graders in a town not far away from us. I also talk about the stranger danger of growing up in the 80s, and then also how my daughters are growing up and some of my fears for them. So how I bring those fears with me to my mothering. And so the essay itself is braided, which means that there's kind of 3 different strands, and they each take a turn kind of being front and center in the essay, even though they may not all be the same in terms of proportion. But a braided essay is also known as like a lyric essay, which is fixated more on the how something is put together than actually what is being stated. And I think that a lyric form like that, a braided essay, is helpful when you're writing about something that, again, you're trying to puzzle through and you don't necessarily want to come at it head on. If that essay had simply been about the murder of Liberty and Abigail, not only would it have been too much, but going back to what we were talking about previously, I would have probably had to come to some sort of conclusion about that murder. And so the essay itself is attempting to get to the bottom of, what does it mean when you have experienced moments of fear or even violence as a younger person, or just a person in general? And then how does that follow you and your interactions with loved ones? And right now, the book, like that essay, like, as I mentioned, is about 3/4 of the way through the book. And you asked why there. And, the book is The Perils of Girlhood, as a book, is mainly chronological. So at that point in my life, I've got my daughters, and I'm beginning to more firmly explore what it is to be a mother of
Mm-hmm.
daughters, as somebody who grew up in the 80s and 90s. But I also feel like at that point in the book, I'm starting to put together more of the threads that I've braided in throughout the book.
Yeah, that makes sense because I felt like I knew the players, the main players, right, before I got here. And what I love about how you do this in the braided form is that it allows these girls to haunt your book,
Mhm.
right? Rather than having them make a point. And they show up again. I mean, you referred this to this again in another essay. And so I feel like that works really well. And I wanted to compare that to another essay that you wrote that has a completely different format, which is the elements of fiction, but
Yeah.
also more lyrical and I would say literary
Mhm.
versus something that's straightforward. Can you tell us about that essay?
Yeah, the Elements of Fiction is, as you mentioned, is a lyric essay. Some might even call it a hermit crab, because I
Mhm.
use the form of the particular elements of fiction as an organizing principle of the essay itself. And it has to deal with a student that I had during my first year teaching college students in Utah, a student who really went out of his way to kind of minimize me, draw attention to the fact that I was young, that I was female, and it ultimately turned into somewhat of a sexual harassment situation. Took me a long time to get right, because initially I did simply write it in the chronological fashion of what had happened with this student. It wasn't until I happened upon that organizational method of realizing I was, at the time, I was teaching a fiction writing class. And when I was able to consider the way that that could be used to, again, organize the time and
Mhm.
also kind of better reflect what was taking place with this student, the essay really opened up. So right now, some of the different section breaks have to do with setting and characterization and climax. So what I do is I
Mhm.
go through this somewhat chronological event with a student, but it's broken up by the different fictional elements, a definition of them, and then how we see that playing out in real time with this student.
Yeah, I feel like you can use this to teach the elements of fiction and the elements of storytelling, and it magnifies what's happening, right? Because we take that element and then we apply it to the actual story. And one thing that really stuck with me is the way this student looked at the narrator. I wanted you to talk about both of these because there is something about the gaze in this one, and then you write so viscerally about the photograph that the young girl, I think it was Liberty, took on
Hmm.
her cell phone
Yes.
of a man, like, who is obviously looking at them and is probably the perpetrator, and how we navigate that all the time.
Yeah, and we probably navigate it on a subconscious level too, I
Mhm.
would say. And I think that that again is the invitation that writing offers us, and that is the chance to reflect and and consider all that we sometimes are burying within us.
Mhm. Yeah, you do a great job of making the unconscious conscious in terms of our experiences. And I would love both women and men to read this so that they can better understand what it's like to live in this world and be female or female identifying, just what that experience is. So we've talked about the vulnerability of this writing, of writing nonfiction, and some of the strategies that you've used to write about vulnerable things in a way that is effective. And I'm curious because you're not just a writer, right? You also teach writing. And as you said, you started off as a fiction writer, so this was something new for you. What has this taught you about teaching writing?
Yeah, I think it's just kind of funny how writing in so many ways feels like being human.
Mhm.
And so I think that writing in some ways has made me a better human because I bring with me with every interaction with every student the realization that I only know as much as they are willing to share. And
Mhm.
so I've got to trust and know that there's a lot more that is not being revealed to me. And so you have to find a way to still be respectful of that which is not stated. And so I just think that I try to value the fact that every student is going to have a different writing process as
Mhm.
well. And there's a lot of different ways to work. And sometimes the key is giving them permission to experiment, whether that be experimenting with form, like those two essays that you're talking about, the elements of fiction or the perils of girlhood. Or, maybe I'm not writing a strict memoir. Maybe I need to write a memoir and essay. So the idea of you don't have to do what somebody else is doing, but really giving them the the tools to check in with themselves. Even today, I taught earlier this morning, and my students were working in small groups. And after they did a short like workshop activity, and after they completed that dialogue with one another, I had them just kind of journal a little bit about their story.
Mhm.
So you write your piece at your desk, and then maybe you share with some trusted readers or trusted fellow writers, and then it comes back to you. What do you envision? What do
Yeah.
you want it to be? And that ultimately has to remain with the writer, with the author.
Yeah, I love that you've said that because I tell people all the time is there are a lot of ways to be right. What's important is that you figure out which one works for you. And yeah, give yourself permission to explore all of the ways that you could do something and then really figure out what is the thing that actually works for you. Well, this has been such an exciting and fun conversation. I'm curious, is there anything else that you would like us to know about the perils of girlhood or writing in general that you haven't had a chance to say?
I just appreciate this opportunity to talk with you, and I appreciate the fact that readers are willing to maybe go into some of those places in their own lives, maybe touching on stories that they've kept to themselves. and
Mhm.
and just as I went back in my life and my experience with girlhood in hopes of supporting my girls, I would just say if there's something that you're holding on to that could possibly be of assistance to somebody else, I hope you take the time to write that down. And it's a gift not just to you, but it's a gift to everybody who reads those words.
Absolutely. You never know who needs your story and how your story is going to help the world. Well, if people want to buy The Perils of Girlhood, which I believe is going to help the world, and I know that it already is, and they want to connect with you, what are the best ways for them to do that?
Sure. On Instagram, I'm Melissa Fraterrigo. They'll probably have to go to the show notes to see how you spell my last name. I'm also on Facebook, and then I have a Substack, Between the Lines.
Beautiful. Well, all of that will be in the show notes. And listeners, please go to the show notes so that you can connect with Melissa. And I want to thank you once again for being on the podcast. This has been so wonderful.
It's been a pure delight. Thank you again for everything, Lisa. I appreciate it so much.
Thank you so much for listening. If you'd like to learn more about Melissa and, most importantly, buy a copy of The Perils of Girlhood, please see the show notes for this episode. But before you go, I would love it if you would text the show if you're on Apple Podcast or Spotify, or leave a comment on YouTube with the answer to the following question. What's one way that writing helps you be a better human? I would love to know the answer to your question. And speaking of your feedback on the show, I want to give a special shout out to Mary Jane 7329 and Shannon's channel for your fantastic follow-up questions to my conversation with Wendy Dale. It was so wonderful to hear from you. And listeners, if you haven't reached out to the show, I would love to hear from you too. I couldn't do this podcast without your support. If you love this episode, here are 3 simple ways that you can keep this show thriving. 1, subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or your favorite podcast platform so you never miss an episode. 2, leave a 5-star review so others can find the show. 3, join my engaged dynamic community by signing up for the Writing and Resilience newsletter. As a thank you, you'll receive a free copy of Ditch Your Inner Critic, 5 tools to transform self-doubt into self-support. Until next time, remember that your story matters. As you write and connect with the truest, most authentic version, you become not just the writer, but the person you're meant to be. And that, my friends, is the real freedom writing can offer.